ladies and gentlemen, there's something like an architecture in the Mises University, or logical order in which the different lectures take place. And this order, by and large, follows the order of exposition that we find in the great treatises of Austrian economics, in particular Human Action, the main work by Ludwig von Mises, and Man, Economy and State, the main work by Murray Rothbard. And in both of these books, we first analyze the economic laws insofar as they exist under the most general conditions of human action. That is, if we just consider one acting individual without his or her interrelations with other persons, then we turn to the laws that apply to the interaction between different human beings. And then there are particular cases, particular forms of interaction. One form would be the market economy, the other one would be a socialist economy, and third we have an interventionist economy. Now, we are here, so on the first day, so we are still on a fairly general level. We had this morning lectures on value and price theory, and you also heard something about the epistemological nature of the science of human action, or the logic of human action. So these are fairly general subjects. And we'll now move on to talk about the interaction of different individuals, and in particular about the division of labor. That's the most fundamental level on which we can talk about this interaction. And that is important because it allows us to analyze, or start the analysis of the economics of production, economic laws that rule the production of goods and services. What I'll do in my lecture is, well, first of all, to highlight a couple of general laws of production, and then we'll focus in particular on the law of returns. And the law of returns will lead us then quite naturally, or allows us to talk quite naturally, about two fundamental ways, or strategies, or mechanisms, or whatever word you prefer, by which human beings can increase the productivity of individual labor. And these are in particular savings investments. And the second strategy is the division of labor. Okay? So, let's start with these general considerations, and we notice, of course, that always when we talk about praxeology, the logic of human action, we are talking about human action or human choice as constrained by natural law. It takes place necessarily in a physical context. Physical context means, well, objects extended through space, also through time, which are limited, and that is the most momentous circumstance that comes here into play. Things are always limited. There's nothing in our universe that we know of empirically that is not limited. This room is extended within certain limitations. The light is only a certain brilliance, certain intensity. The speed with which I can talk is only limited. Your capacity for following rapid speech is also limited, and so on. Your capacity for understanding things, etc. So we're always limited by, well, the physical nature of the human body, the physical nature of the other objects of our environment. And this implies certain facts for production. Well, before we talk about production, of course, we need a definition. Production is the conscious transformation of the natural environment of the human being. Now, strictly speaking, okay, let's first talk generally. So, of course, this concerns the transformation of the soil, for example, as in agriculture. And we're seeding plants and so on. So we're transforming the state of nature as it would exist without our intervention. But also when we set up factories, when we produce microphones and so on, we are always using material substances that we find in nature and transform them. We turn them from one state of affair, from one state into another state. Why do we do this? Well, of course, because we prefer the end result, the end state, to the stage in which it would have been otherwise. We prefer a field with wheat, planted with wheat, to just the soil on which other plants would have grown, and wheat not cultivated and so on. Well, because, and the reason is, of course, that thereby we are able to better satisfy our human needs. So value always steers production, right? But value is, of course, not all that comes into play when we talk about production. So we have a conscious transformation of nature, and the new state of affairs, the new state of nature, has a higher subjective value. Well, as I said, strictly speaking, now when we talk about nature, we mean in economics everything that is not determined by the human will. Okay, so strictly speaking, among the nature that we have in mind also belongs our body. We can transform our own body according to our will. So several young men here obviously work out. So they're transforming nature. So you can see, well, the shape that they've given to their body is an act of production. They've taken the substance, the material that they found from the outset, and then transformed it by lifting weights and running uphill and downhill, doing various other things, brought their body into a different shape, and so on. And of course, for the ladies among our audience, the same thing holds true, right? Of course, you could let your hair grow and the fingernails and so on as they go naturally, but you don't do this. You transform, again, your body according to certain designs, and that is also because you value the new state of affairs higher than it would have been without this intervention. Now, production is necessarily extended in time, and it follows therefrom again, a certain limitation of the things that we can do, because, well, time is limited, our lifespan is limited, also a day is only 24 hours, so there's only so and so many things that we can do in time. But beyond this limitation, there's another aspect, because, well, action is extended in time, it forces us to do things in a sequence. We do one thing after the other. And in the case of production, this is important because one significant strategy by which we can increase the productivity of labor consists in using capital goods, consists in using instruments, if you wish. Right? It's by using a lamp, for example, that I can increase my intellectual labor. If there were no lamps, if there were no artificial light, I would depend on daylight, so I could work only, let's say, from 9 to 6 p.m. Because there are lamps, I can also work, if I wish, in the evening hours, very early in the morning, and through the night, if my wife doesn't slap me on the head. And the same thing also for other things, well, because we have microphones, right? I can reach even the last row, otherwise my feeble voice would only reach the first 3 rows, and so on. So we can increase the productivity of our labor with the help of instruments. Now this implies, of course, that first we produce the instruments, and then we can use them in our labor. So if we want to illustrate this with a very primitive diagram, but mostly primitive diagrams are the best ones. Say we have here the passage of time, time x, and I want to enjoy the services of a definite type of, well, consumer good or consumer service at point of time t0. Let's say, so we have here the consumer good. Consumer's good. Well, then this implies, of course, that in order to prepare this, I need to fabricate my instrument at t minus 1. T minus 1. Oh, that's a European one, right? So for you Americans, something like this, okay? And then the question is, well, how do I best produce? So that we have here a producer's good, right? That we produce here, producer's good. Now I have a very beautiful handwriting, which indicates to you that I'm in the line of a great tradition of German artists. You might have heard of Lucas Cranach the Elder, Otto Dix, and then others in my generation. So we need to have this producer's good here at t minus 1. And then the question again is, well, how to best produce this producer's good? Well, I could produce it with my bare hands, then I'm limited. Or I could produce it again with the help of other instruments, which in turn presupposes that I first produce these other instruments, and so on. So we're moving still further back in time, t minus 2, etc., t minus 3. So let's say we call this producer's good 1, and here we have producer good 2, and here we have the producer good 3, and it's really not limited. I mean, this can go back, well, not indefinitely, of course. It's not infinity, but very far back. And we have here, therefore, a particular relationship between different goods that exists as a matter of natural law, or praxeological law, if you wish. There always exists such a relationship between consumer goods and different producer goods that are related to one another through a particular sequence that is enjoined on the producer by the very nature of the production process. In order to speak, to reach the last rows in my lecture, well, I need to have a microphone. In order to have a microphone, I first need to have some steel and some other fibers, cables, and so on. In order to have this, I need first to dig things out of the ground, etc., etc. So we have this relationship, which we also can call a structure, a time structure of production. Right? That's the word that we often hear, we find in Austrian analysis. It's a time structure of production. And we have different orders here of producer goods. This is a first order producer goods, so this Roman 1 producer goods, because it's right. The good that follows is a consumer's good. It's a first order producer's good. And then we move back in time, we come to a second order producer's good, third order producer's good, etc. And these are therefore then higher order goods. Okay? So we have a certain order of production, first order goods, and higher order goods. Now, a second consideration is the quantitative relationship between the different factors of production that I use and the product. And here there is one law of nature that is for us particularly interesting, because it tells us that there is no strict proportionality between the quantities of factors of production that we use and the product that results from it. Let's take an example. And say we have, we consider the case of production of wheat, and we have here 4 factors of production, 4 producers' goods: fertilizer, land, labor, and seed. Okay, 4 factors of production. Now, these 4 factors of production can be used in different proportions. Right? There are other production processes in which you just have a distinct combination of factors of production, otherwise the product will not be good. An important example would be cooking. Okay, I mean, there are, of course, artists like myself who can produce decent pasta with virtually any quantity of salt, any quantity of pasta, any quantity of water, and so on. But, I mean, there are picky eaters who only like the result if it's made within certain margins, right, of the variation of these factors. But in other cases, it's even more extreme. So, for example, wheat planting can be done in various ways. We can, for example, if we consider just these 4 factors of production that I mentioned, we can imagine cultivating wheat with much labor and with less labor. Labor can, to some extent, be replaced by other factors of production. Right? Maybe by a greater quantity of seed, maybe by a greater quantity of fertilizer. Land also can be substituted for by a greater quantity of another factor of production, seed, etc. Now the question is, even in those cases in which there's some flexibility and so on, is the quantity of the product that we obtain in strict proportion to the quantity of the factor of production that we use? And here we have a natural law that tells us that is not the case. And this natural law is called the law of returns. Okay, so you write down the law of returns. And according to the law of returns, there exists for any combination of factors or for any number of factors of production, an optimal combination, which yields the optimal amount of product. Now let's illustrate this in the following way. You can again use a graph. With your Q, which is the quantity of the product, and X is the quantity of the factor of production that I use. Now what the law of returns tells me is, again, so there's an optimum, that is, if I go beyond the use of this factor X, well, I will actually diminish my product. Okay, so there's an optimum somewhere, let's say here. And what the law of return tells me is that this is an X star, an optimal quantity of this factor of production, could be seed, could be land, right? Given the quantities of the other factors of production. Okay, and that's important. You know this, important condition. Given the quantities of the other factors of production, there is for any one factor of production an optimal amount. That is, for a greater quantity of this product, the quantity produced will decline, for example, to this quantity and here. And for smaller quantities of the same factor, it will also decline. For example, this way. Now, I dotted here a couple of points because not all products can be perfectly divided. We don't have perfect visibility and so on. In the case of certain products, we can do this, and then we can draw nice curves. For example, this one. Right. And we call this the curve of physical product, of the physical product, or PP. Now again, what's important here is not the curve. Okay, what's important is what I put down first, namely that there's a maximum. Okay, so the rest is only embellishment, and you have a nice curve, so some people it facilitates memorizing and so on, but the important thing really is that there's this maximum. Now, if we look closer at this curve, we'll find then that at this point here, when we reach the maximum, the marginal product, that is the additional product that results from the use of an additional quantity of the factor X, is just 0. Right? So we find, if we draw a different curve of the marginal physical product, we are here, and thereafter the additional product is actually negative. The additional product that results from this additional use of the factor of production turns into the negative realm. On the other hand, on the left side of this optimal point, we have increasing returns, or positive returns. So we have such a curve, which, to make matters simple, I represent here as some sort of a straight line, but it does not at all have to be this line. We call this the marginal physical product. So the marginal physical product is declining. No. Okay, again, what's important are not these curves, but the maximum. And the maximum tells me, so there's some limitation to my efforts. Whatever I do, however I vary this factor X, I cannot get beyond this point. Now the question is, am I limited for all times, or how come that we have improved the physical product per unit of labor, per labor hour, as we have, without doubt, done in the past, for example, in the course of the past 200 years. Today, per unit of labor in the United States, much more product is being yielded than 200 years ago. So how is this possible? Obviously, this is not an absolute limit here, but it's conditioned by something else. Okay? Now, what is this limitation? Well, it relates to what I said before. this law of return, this limitation of the productive power of each factor of production holds only ceteris paribus, all other things being equal. And the more these other things that we held equal are the quantities of the other factors of production. So in my example before, we just were varying, for example, the amount of labor that we used. Right? But we said, okay, given the quantities of, well, the extent of our field, given the quantity of seed that we have, given the quantity of fertilizer, we just vary labor. And then we have a limit. And the same thing can also be said for the fertilizer. If I have the same quantity of soil, same quantity of seed, same quantity of labor, I just vary the fertilizer, and there is a limit. And obviously, this is the case, as we know empirically, because if it were not the case, then we could, well, plant all the wheat for the entire world on 2 square yards or even 1 square yard. We just add more fertilizer, right? Which is not possible. So how can we increase this limit? Well, by varying these other factors of production. Let's look at how this works out. So I have again here my diagram. Quantity of the product, quantity of the factor of production x, and I have here my curve that represents the physical product. And now what happens if I increase one of these other factors, I get a shift of the curve. Okay, so this curve shifts somewhere here. Okay, we can come back on our example. I have a certain amount of these 4 factors of production, and X is labor. Now let's suppose I increase the amount of fertilizer that I use. I double the amount of fertilizer. Then now my labor, which before had here its optimal point, right, X, this amount of labor will now produce this amount of product. But what is more, also the point where we have the maximum amount of product will shift. It's no longer at this point here. So this was optimal amount of X1. Now we have the optimal amount here. Or the maximum, it's not necessarily the optimum, but the maximum amount. We have it here. Okay. So we are still limited, and that's of course, so the law of return still holds, and we're still limited, but we are now limited at a higher level. Put it in other words, we have extended our bottleneck. We imagine, well, another example, you want to get out the liquid out of the bottle as quickly as possible. Well, what limits you? Well, it's the bottleneck, because the bottle is larger in all other places, and what limits the speed with which you can get the water out of the bottle is the smallest, or the weakest part in the chain of production. Okay, and what we do here, therefore, is to increase the bottleneck. We make it larger. We're still limited, but limited on a higher level. Another example, so of course, and this holds true, again, for all types of production, any type of conscious transformation of labor, because it always has something to do with limited things. Another example would be, say, the production of coffees served in a coffee shop. Okay, what are the factors of production in a coffee shop? Well, you have a certain location. That's the secret of retail marketing. Location, location, and location. And you have, well, tables, chairs, coffee machines, and you have the waiters. Okay, so you have various factors of production again. I'm always limited. The number of coffees that I can serve is limited by the law of returns. If I increase the size of my shop, well, that's what I can serve more coffees because, for example, the space between the tables is larger, so the waiters can run, whereas before they had to be careful and move through it and so on. Now they are real fast and get more coffees and so on. Same thing, I hire simply more waiters, more coffees are served and so on. Okay, so we have this law of returns, and we have an understanding of the essential mechanism by which we increase the productivity of human labor. Because of all factors of production, it's human labor, a factor X human labor, that we are most interested in. And that is because human labor is the most scarce factor of production. There is no production process in which we do not use some labor. Okay? Now that's the point in which my students in France always look at me with great eyes. Don't we have 3 million unemployed or 4 million unemployed? So how can you possibly say that labor is most scarce? Well, I don't say that we always make a wise use of our scarcest factor of production, right? Okay. The scarcest factor of production could also be a pen. Of course, if you throw all pens in the dustbin, well, you're not better off, right? Our legs are very important. If you shoot into the right leg, well, you're not necessarily better off. So some of our labor market policies are the equivalent of shooting into the right leg. Of course, you have only the left leg left. Okay, since labor is the scarcest factor of production, and labor is used everywhere, that is, labor is a relatively non-specific factor of production, okay, it follows that there exists an interrelationship between all production processes. Okay, let's take the following example. Let's consider two production processes. So we have the law of returns, let's say this here is labor, or let's say L, again we have L, and here we have, let's say, butter and tanks. Okay, we can either produce butter or tanks. One of very famous, one of the economists' preferred examples, butter and tanks, very Marshall and so on. Okay, so in both cases, we have some sort of, the law of return will make itself felt in some curve. The curves do not necessarily, as in my case, you have very similar shapes, but in any case, both curves have a maximum. That's the important thing. Now, we can transpose this and show the interconnection by putting them into a 4-quadrant scheme. But before I illustrate this graphically, and that's really just to impress you, I explain the general relationship. Because factors of production are scarce, every hour of labor that are put into the production of tanks obviously is no longer available for other production processes, such as butter producing. And every day or whatever, or minute that are used for butter producing is no longer available for the tanks. So there must be a negative relationship between the two products. The more butter I produce, the less tanks I can make. The more tanks I make, the less butter is available. Okay? And this, well, we can do also graphically. Let's say we have here labor used in tanks. We have here labor used for butter making. And then we know that there is, because the amount of labor is limited in time, so we have here a relationship between the two, right? Here we have, let's say, 16 hours. Of course, in the case of the American economy, I would have put here 20 hours. The Japanese economy, 22 hours. And in case that the French students fear most, the Chinese economy, 24 hours. Okay, so yeah, 24 hours either butter making, and there's no sleeping, no drinking and so on, right? They're either fully into the butter business or tank business, of course. Yeah, horror. But let's say for us, we are lazy Westerners. We need to read Mises from time to time, right? So there's something else to do. So we have 16 hours at our disposition, which we can either use fully for tank making, so we would be at this point, or fully for butter making, then we would be here at this point, or for some combination between the two. Okay? Now, we have here the quantity of butter and whatever, in kilograms or tons, and the number of tanks. Now tanks, you will say, well, no tanks are created equal. No two tanks are created exactly equal. Okay, I grant your point, okay? But we'll still now assume that these are German precision tanks or Swiss. So they're fairly similar. And so we can draw a physical production curve here and one here. So all that I do, in this case, I simply put this curve, I turn it a little bit and plug it here, and I take this curve and turn it 90 degrees, sorry, 180 degrees, and put it here. Okay, that's all that has happened. And now I can draw into this quadrant, I can draw the physical product of the combination of the two. For example, if I use this combination of time, let's say, so this is whatever here, 10 hours of butter making and 6 hours of tank making, then I will get such quantities of butter and such quantities of tanks. Now, which means for their combination that I will find myself at some point here. Okay, and I can do this also for another combination of time, for example here. Tuck, 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 tuck. So I have this point, and I have this point here, and I have this point here. Okay, and then I can combine all these points. If I draw them all together, I get a curve of this shape. Now that is what we call the production possibilities frontier, PPF. It shows me the combined production possibilities for my economy. Here I've taken this, consider just a simple case of two goods, right? And the curve tells me which combinations of butter and tanks I can possibly produce with the available quantities of my factors of production, in particular of labor. And again, what is important here is not the concrete shape of the curve, but in any case it represents a limitation, a physical limitation. Okay, I cannot because I'm bound by the laws of nature, by the laws of physical limitation, I cannot transgress this frontier. So in what follows, we just need to consider the PPF. And now we can raise again the question there's at the beginning, so how can we enlarge this limitation? The question is now for the economy as a whole, how can we move this frontier, this limitation? So we have here the good one. Good 1, x1. Here we have the good 2, x2. Butter, tanks, microphones or carpets, lamps and chairs, orchestra, concertos, and conferences. Right? There's always, for any combination of good, there's always such an overall limitation. The question is now, how can I extend this? Here I'm limited. If I want to have more of x, well, I've got to renounce to of x1, I've got to renounce to some of x2, etc. How can I move the curve here to this level, for example? Let's say this would be my PPF2. PPF2, and this would be PPF1. How can I do this? And here the two mechanisms come into play that I mentioned before. Namely, savings investment on the one hand, and the division of labor on the other hand. Now let's illustrate first how how this would work out in the case of savings investments, and then turn to the division of labor. In order to understand savings investment, the impact of savings investment on the PPF, we just need to say, okay, what we consider now is the relationship between producer's good. X1 is, let's say, is now as a producer's good. And X2 would be a consumer's good. And with the PPF, I could also analyze the relationship between two consumers' goods or two producers' goods, doesn't matter. Or present good and a future good. It holds for all combinations of any two goods. So now here we're considering, so either I can produce more producers' goods, more tools, or I can produce more consumers' goods. If I produce more consumers' goods, it means at the same time, that's the meaning, because I'm limited by scarcity, that the amount of my producers' goods will reduce, and as a consequence, therefore, the quantities of factors of production that I will have in the future will diminish. Therefore, my human labor will be less productive. Okay? Therefore, also the overall production will shrink. And inversely, if I, let's say, rather than choosing this point, I choose this point here, this combination, a high proportion of producers' goods and a small proportion of consumers' goods, well, then I have less to consume now, but since I build up, produce more tools that will help me to be more productive in the future, well, I will have a greater quantity of consumers' goods in the future. We can distinguish here three cases. Yeah. Do it this way. We have first of all a stationary economy. So if here the producers' goods are also called capital goods and the consumers' goods. And in a stationary economy, I produce just such a combination that I just rebuild the tools that I've consumed in the past. Right? So my capital, my producers' goods and so on are used up in the production process, so I need to replace them. And if I choose, let's say, this combination between consumers' goods and producers' goods, I will just rebuild the tools that I've used up. So I will always have the same combination of producers' goods and consumer goods in my economy. My consumption will remain the same. Otherwise said, I am in a stationary economy. That's the meaning of a stationary economy. Now, we see here, we have the case of a growing economy. So this was my initial point, this combination. Now I make a different choice. I become more frugal. I consume less. As I produce less consumers' goods, I produce more producers' goods. I choose this combination. And the consequence is that in the next period, my PPF, my production possibilities, will increase. So my PPF curve moves from this level to this level here. And if I go on producing more producers' goods than consumer goods, well, it will shift even more to the right. So we have here the case of a growing economy. It's one essential growth mechanism, producing more producers' goods than consumer goods. So you produce producers' goods beyond what you would need to replace the old, used up producers' goods. And inversely, we have, of course, the case of a shrinking economy. So again, we have this initial combination here, which is the same as here in the stationary economy. Now we make different choices. We choose to produce this combination of consumers' goods and producers' goods, so more consumer goods, less producers' goods, which means that in the next period, well, we will not have replaced all the tools that we have used up. So, in the over next period, our production possibilities will decrease. So our curve shifts inward and the economy shrinks. It's a very practically relevant case because particular government expenditure is this, right? It's a higher proportion of consumer goods, maybe goods that the government likes, tanks, for example, nannies, housemaids for senators, and similar things. And as a consequence, we consume more than we produce, and so our production possibilities in the next period will decrease, and so evermore. Now, what's also important here is, again, that we can illustrate here that the question whether our economy grows or shrinks is not something that falls from the heavens, okay? That's not a fact of nature. What is a fact of nature as a law of nature is the limitation. But it's we who make the choices. The points that we choose, or the points at which we find ourselves on the PPF, that does not fall from heaven, okay? That's our choice. And so it's a moral dimension here that we can illustrate. So we have frugal market participants or frugal members of society who will choose to have a low proportion of consumer goods and a high proportion of producers' goods being produced, and as a consequence you have a growing economy. Right? That's the impact of morals on growth. It's a choice that is being made. The choice is not enforced on us by any external event. So we have here one crucial growth mechanism, but there's a second growth mechanism, and this brings us to the title of our lecture. But I said to you, well, the division of labor and society, what we are really talking about here is the economics of production, okay, the basic economic laws of production. So we're now considering the second great mechanism by which I can increase the productive power of each factor of production, which is the division of labor. So in a division of labor, the different individuals coordinate their activities. Each one of them produces in excess of what he would need for himself or what he would need personally, and shares his product with the other guy. And usually this sharing is done not in the matter of a gift, or of a pure gift or unconditional gift, but in the way of an exchange. And that's what the very meaning of coordination. I do produce in excess of my own needs, because you do the same thing, and then afterwards we exchange. I give in order that you give. It's not completely unrelated. So again, what is steering production, and in this case in particular the concertation of the different individuals, their coordination, what is steering this is again value and exchange. That's the driving the force, what gives orientation to the coordination process. But the coordination itself is again limited by laws of nature, by laws of production. So let's have a look at this. Why does this work in the first place? This coordination, why is it worthwhile? Well, because different individuals, of course, that's what we think of, are good at different things. Okay, I might be an excellent gun maker, and another one is excellent in butter making. So per unit of time, I produce much more guns than butter, and the other individual produces much more butter than guns. Okay, so it's good for us to coordinate. Say, okay, now I'm not only producing the guns for me, but also for you, and you will produce butter for me, and therefore cut down on your gun production. We can illustrate this the following case. So we have two individuals, and we will represent now in order to make clear what the mechanics are in this case. So we have guns and butter for individual A, and here we have guns and butter for individual B. And let's say individual A has this ppf, okay, and individual B has this ppf. So you see the ppfs are very different shapes. And what we do in the division of labor, by the way, what we do in exchange generally, is to exploit such differences. We profit from the fact that we are unequal. If they were both perfectly equal, it would be very difficult for them to engage in an exchange. In particular, it would be pointless. And there could be no material benefits could be derived from such a coordination. But let's say A desires this combination between guns and butter, and B desires this combination, right? Then we see that A, in order to obtain some more guns, well, he has to he can do this at the cost of relatively few kilograms of butter. Let's say, okay, he wants to increase his gun production from here to here. So we have this increase in gun production. Then he would the price he would have to pay, so to say, is this reduction in butter production. For individual B, it would be very different. You see that if he wanted to increase his gun production in a similar way, let's say he was initially here and he wanted to have that much more guns, so about the same amount as here, he would have to renounce at this amount, renounce to this amount of butter, so much more greater amount of butter. Okay, so in other words, what economists call the opportunity cost of gun production is much lower for this individual than for this individual. And inversely, the opportunity cost of butter making is much lower for this individual than for this individual. So there is an incentive for both of them, a material incentive to share the labor. A will specialize on gun production, B will specialize on butter production. Okay, and as a consequence, the total quantities produced will increase. Let's say before the division of labor, both were not taking account of the other guy. A had produced, make up an example, right? A had produced whatever, 2 shotguns. Europeans, do you know what a shotgun is? Okay, well, we'll show you. And whatever, 100 kilograms of butter. And this guy made whatever, 1 shotgun, and he wasn't good at it in the first place, right? It took him the entire day almost. And whatever, and 80 kilograms of butter. Or let's say 180 kilograms of butter. There's always my European 1, right? It's not a 7, it's a 1. Okay, 180 kilograms. So after the division of labor, so here we have a total 3 shotguns and 280 kilograms of butter. What the division of labor does is to increase this total. So it would, for example, would result in 5 shotguns and 350 kilograms of butter. Okay. So there is a material incentive for the two of them to do precisely that, to coordinate their tasks, to share their productive efforts, because the physical quantities of goods and services produced will increase. So we have 2 additional shotguns and 70 additional kilograms of butter that can be distributed among the two as a consequence of the division of labor. Both can profit, therefore, from it. Now, it's an interesting question. What will be the precise proportion in which these additional quantities will be distributed amongst them? And the answer to this question, well, is delivered by the theory of market pricing. Okay, so here you read Human Action, Chapter 15, Murray Rothbard's book, various chapters in Man, Economy and State, and other good textbooks, etc. And we'll talk in some of the other lectures about this too. All right, so there's a different compartment, a more specific question about which I will not talk. Here we're talking just about the basic fact that, well, as a consequence of the division of labor, the physical quantities increase, and this is as a matter of law of nature. Okay. Now, so this is the first case in which we have this specialization, case 1, but there are 2 other cases. There's case 2, in which both individuals are exactly equal, clones. Okay? And indeed, to the extent that they're exactly equal, there's no material incentive for them to divide labor amongst them. There's no material benefits to be derived from it. So this leads us to the important conclusion that, well, inequality, material inequality in capacities and so on between different individuals, far from representing an obstacle to association, to cooperation, is in fact an incentive to do this. What we do in society is exploit our relative strengths and weaknesses. Okay? And if we are all clones, we won't be able to do this. And as a consequence, if we can imagine this for just a second in fact, it is not really possible that we have such a society of perfect clones for various reasons that I will not go into now. But if we had it, well, it would not lead to greater unity. It would lead to a falling apart of society, because precisely the most important driving motor, driving force of this association would fall away. Now there is case 3. Case 3 is what I call the, in honor of my students at home, the French case, the French and Chinese case. Okay, so we have here one exchange partner who is the Superman, and here we have the, well, not the complete zero, but the underling. Okay, so in former years this was the Aryan and this was whatever. The underling. Now it's the Chinese economy and the French economy. Right? They can do everything better. There's no reason at all why they would need us. Right? We get steamrolled and baked potatoes and so on, and we are being turned into baked potatoes, but there's no more use for us. So one of the great contributions of economic analysis is to show that even in this case there's a fruitful division of labor possible. Now, let's illustrate this with the following example. We have two individuals, Peter and Paul, who are also producing two goods. I mean, they are hunting rabbits and picking berries. Okay? So let's consider this case. So this is their production figures before the division of labor. So Peter they have a 10-hour labor day, so it's not even American standard, right? So that's Germany before 1948. Peter, so in 10 hours he dedicates 5 hours to chasing 5 rabbits and 5 hours to plucking 1,000 berries. Paul dedicates also 5 hours to chasing 1 rabbit, and in another 5 hours he picks 500 berries. So Peter is superior in all production processes. Right? He's the Chinese guy, and Paul is the poor French guy. As a consequence of the total production of the two partners, 6 rabbits and 1,500 berries. Now they could engage in the following division of labor. Peter, or let's say Paul, specializes in berry picking, right? And so he dedicates 10 hours to the picking of berries, so 500 times 2 is 1,000 berries, and Peter slightly readjusts his allocation of time to the different production processes. So he picks a little less berries, reduces it by 2 hours, and as a consequence he picks 600 berries rather than 1,000 before, and dedicates more time to hunting rabbits, and he hunts down 7 rabbits rather than 5. Now, if we compare the production figures, we have indeed increased the total production of this partnership. Now we have 7 rabbits hunted down and 1,600 berries picked. Okay, so what does this tell us? It tells us, well, even if we have the underling case, the French-Chinese case, even in this case there is a fruitful division of labor possible. Each partner of the two has an incentive to engage in the division of labor with the other. Right? So of course we would say, well, for the French guy, of course, he would like to enjoy the Chinese goods, but what incentive could the Chinese guy have, or the Chinese economy have, in using French goods? They can do everything better on their own. Well, the answer is, well, in general is given here. Well, they can benefit too if they readjust their production. Right? If one of them, for example, in this case, specializes on those things on which he is least inferior, right? So he's 1 to 5 inferior in rabbit hunting, but only 1 to 2 inferior in berry picking. So the French economy specializes on berry picking, and the Chinese economy slightly readjusts the proportion of its products. And that's, my ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly what's going on today. The Chinese economy is today producing 3/4 of all washing machines in the world. Okay, imagine this, 3/4 of all washing machines in the world right now. And that's not bad for us, that's very good for us. Okay? Of course, it's bad for those entrepreneurs who before have been producing washing machines in the West because they cannot compete with the Chinese in this regard. So they will fire their people and no longer extend their credits and so on. Well, but it means that all these factors of production become available for other things. The workers are being hired elsewhere, probably at lower wage rates. The capital is no longer invested in washing machine making, but in other things. Other things that are even not important enough for the Chinese. So we do these things. And that's how division of labor, operates in a dynamic economy. You constantly readjust the proportions of the things that you do in order to be in tune with the other producers. But there's never any case in which we have to fear, well, there's too much, or there's one guy superior, we don't need him at all. There are always material incentives for all partners to engage in such a consultation, such a division of labor. And the general consequence is, of course, as we have seen before, economic growth. Right? So here we have absolute figures. The economy grows. The quantity of producers' goods being produced do grow. And that's one of the things that, in spite of growing government intervention in our day, still saves us. Right? We're much worse off than we would be if our friends in Washington and elsewhere did not constantly shoot us into the right leg. Right? But we're much better off because we have our friends in China and elsewhere who help us concentrate on those things that we can produce on top of this, and they're taking over other things that we did before. Okay, we have 2 minutes for questions. We'll be glad to take them now.
Is there something about certain economies that they're able to grow faster than others?
Sure.
Is your paradigm here explaining? In other words, in this case, it appears that maybe the Chinese didn't grow quite so fast.
Yeah, well, growth rates are can be different as a consequence of the way the division of labor is being made. That's one thing, but there's no systematic impact that we can single out. So we cannot say on a priori grounds it's always so that the bigger country before, for example, would profit more from the division of labor. That holds true in certain cases, but not in other cases. Right? The single most important factor that explains advance for approximately similar growth rates for all countries involved are savings investments, okay, and government interventionism. So if you have one economy that saves, invests more than others, they tend to grow a little bit faster because in time, well, there's also the tendency for capital being invested abroad. And otherwise, you have the shooting and the lag factor, right? You have government. Actually, so the most important thing to create growth rate differentials is to prevent people from growing. Okay, that's what our governments are particularly good at. Thank you very much.